Hi everybody, Tim here, finally back in the saddle as it were. Right here I've got a 48-inch piece long 3/4 inch PVC and I'm dying to get making a bow again. Actually had a request for one that was 20 to 30 pounds, later set at 25 to 30 pounds at about 26 inches. Somewhere between 25 and 27 is probably a good place to begin that range of about 25 to 30 pounds. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make a pretty normal bow. I'm just going to flatten taper the tips. I'm not even going to show you the way that I flatten all of this, because you've seen that a million times. How to basically heat it up, flatten the ends. In this case, I'm making the handle 2.5 inches on each side of true center. So that's where we are, and I'm going to flatten it, and the next time you'll see this, it will be flat, ready to go, and I'll get right onto the tips. So here we go. So here we are. I flattened it. I wanted to show you something else now. I'm going to do a little correction because now, normally when I make these, I don't make the limbs at the same time. I don't have two jigs and I can't hold them down. So the limbs are going to be slightly twisted. You get a little bit of a propeller effect. I think, yeah, you see that? There it is. So one limb is like this, the other's like that. I'm going to show you how I correct that. You could probably figure it out on your own, but hey, let's just go ahead and do it. So right now, all I'm going to do is I'm going to heat right near the center. If I was going to, this bow, since I want it to be very light, I'm not going to flatten the handle. I'm going to leave it a little bit thicker, which not only will lend lateral stability, it'll be less likely to flop sideways one way or another, but it will also weaken the bow in the center a little bit, so it'll bend a little bit more on the handle, which is exactly what I want. We want this to be a fairly light bow, so that's acceptable here. So what I would do if I was going to flatten the handle is I'd do them both at the same time. I would heat from one side to the other. You see the tiny creases? I'm still going to heat that gently to take those creases away, but what I'd normally do is I would heat from one side to the other and get rid of the creases and soften the handle so I could squish it and flatten it at the same time as correcting the propeller twist. But since I'm not doing that, I'm just going to go ahead and do it like this. I'm focusing on about a 1 to 2, maybe 2 inch area at the center of the handle. Constantly moving the heat gun and constantly moving the bow itself, the blank. So that's really all this is a bow blank. It's not a bow yet. I haven't cut nocks. So once it starts to soften, and you'll want it to be fairly soft, there you go, you see it's starting to bend easy in the center. Great. Now just look down it again and you see which way do you have to bend it. Okay, so I'm going to bend the top, this limb in my left hand a little bit to the left. Then just look down the limbs again. Say, yep, still there. Twist again. How's it now? That's pretty good. Okay, now the other thing is you're going to want to look down it as you're making it to make sure that you don't end up cocking the limbs off to the side. The last thing you want is a bow that'll freeze up like this, sort of bent. So just keep looking down the limbs, through the handle, and line them up. It's as simple as that. So now the propeller twist is gone, the bow is straight. I'm just going to take it to the sink, and I'm going to run it under some water. There you go. So this is a beautiful, ready to go stave. The next forming that I'm going to do is of the outer limbs. I'm going to go ahead and shape and flatten them. I'm going to take about 4 or 5 inches. Let's see. Yeah, let's call it 4.5 inches maybe. Each limb. I'm going to mark that. And I'm going to heat them until they turn round again. Then I'm going to curl them forward and flatten them in that curled state. Let's go ahead and do the tips now. I've marked 4, 4.5, and 5 inches. And that's just so I have a little bit of flexibility to index them. So when I do one, I can then take have a better idea of exactly how I've bent it, because you want it to be fairly even. And I know I'll measure to 4, but occasionally you'll heat a little bit too far. You'll slop outside, you'll do it a little inside. This just gives me a little bit of room to play with, and a little bit of, basically I've made a ruler right on here so I can try and replicate it as closely as possible. When heating up the ends like this, when it's already been flattened, be very careful not to overheat the limbs. The flat parts are fine. There's lots of area for the heat to spread out on. But the thin parts on the side, the heat has only one way to go. Just take a look at that. It can only go down. You're trying to put a lot of heat into a very narrow area versus a very wide area, so the heat doesn't dissipate as quickly. It tends to overheat, and that's a very bad thing. That's when you tend to get things like tears in the pipe when it's severely overheated like that locally. The plastic will degrade and just rip on its own. You won't even have to touch it, it'll just tear. So take a little bit longer than you'd like. I always try and rush this, but you really can't. You really shouldn't. And if you do, you're just asking for failure. Just go ahead and let things happen as they happen. When I'm doing flat recurves with pin style knocks, I try and heat it only as far as necessary to allow me to deform it into a recurve shape. When I'm doing this style, I want it to be completely round and soft. So basically, we're just bringing the pipe back to full round. There you go. And it's coming out just to 4.5 inches like I wanted. I'm just going to angle it away from the center so I don't expand the heat area too much. If you angle it like this, you're blasting hotter down the limb, and I don't want to do that. Okay. That's pretty nice. Yep. Perfect. So now we've got that. We can hold it like this. And then while it's being held like that, I'm going to squish it. So with my fingers here, I'm just going to draw it forward. With my other hand, holding it to the side here, I'm going to flatten it. And it's going to be a differential taper. That is, I'm not holding the tapering jig here flat. I'm holding it at an angle. Because I want it to be fattest at the bottom, which will also minimize the puffing at the bottom. And it'll be narrowest at the top. It gives a nice graceful taper. You can control the severity of the reflex here. If you can see my left hand, I'm just flexing the bow back and forth. That's what I mean. If you want it to be a more severe reflex, you can push the handle forward away from your body. If you want it to be less severe, pull it towards your body. Just use common sense and try and do the same thing to both limbs. Okay, so it's not hard yet. So I'm going to go ahead and play around with it like that. I'm going to continue flattening it just a little bit more. Cool. This is pretty good. Now, under the water. So there it is. It's not as curved as I would have liked, but again, if you want to make sure you get a really steep curve, you can stick something in there and pull it forward. I can't keep my finger in there very well as I crush it. So I'm happy with that, and now I'm going to go ahead and do the exact same thing to the other limb, the other side. That'll give me a nice recurve. Then when I'm done with it, what I like to do is I mark a point right at the end where it starts to come forward, and I saw forward to about halfway up the tip. And that, again, lightens the tip, makes the bow a little faster, because mass near the tips will affect performance much more dramatically than mass near the handle. So removing as much of that as possible is good, but it just looks nicer, looks, I think, a little bit more elegant. Some styles of bow, like a Manchu bow or a Mongolian bow, you might want to leave more on there because it just looks more appropriate, but in this case I'm going to be removing a good bit of it. So let me do the other side now, and then we'll look at the final result here. I'm then going to cut nocks, and we can go outside and start testing to see exactly what the ultimate strength of this bow is and what sort of modifications I'll need to make to it. We're done now. I've added recurves to both of the limbs, flattened them, tapered them. The only thing that remains is to go ahead and correct any tilt, any off axis that you have with the seas. Because now if you look down it, you'll see that here's one. This one's kinked off to the right. That one's pretty darn straight. So let's just try and heat this one near the base just a little bit and then twist it back in axis. Now remember, we don't want to puff it. We don't want to do any deformation. We don't want to lose any of the recurve. We just want it to be deformable, which should really only take about 30 seconds. Maybe less. Okay, so give that a try now. I'm just looking down it, just see if you can give it a twist and if it'll respond. Yeah, there's a little response. Maybe not enough, but that is pretty darn close. Now, I'm going to do the same thing to the other side. So now this side looks almost perfect, and this side looks a tiny bit out of axis. So, just go over here and do it. These are the little finish details that'll make your bow stand out. You don't need to do this. Believe me, I've made plenty of bows where it's not perfectly lined up. It shoots just fine. Some of them are even better than fine. You can see in some of Nick's bows, his snaky bows, they're intentionally made curling which way, this way and that. You may find you like it better because the string then goes a little further to the edge of the bow, making the effective center closer to effectively you'd be able to use an arrow of higher spine in a weaker bow. So you may like that. But I think it's best to start off trying to make a bow as close to neutral as possible. Okay, let's see. This one I overheated just a touch. It's starting to, it wants to lose some deflex, but that's okay. I got it. Holding it. Great. Okay. So now it is maybe not 100% perfect, but really, really close. That's good. That's very good. You see now? If anything, maybe this one could be touched a ting, just a tiny little ding to the left. But we don't need to do that on camera. So I'll go ahead and make any final corrections that I need to do. I'm going to cool it off, and then we'll go outside and cut some nocks so we can begin testing. You'll notice that unlike the youth recurve bows, which have the final 6 inches recurved, they can have quite a bit of reflex, of recurve at the tips. This has about half as much. that's good. That effectively makes the bow longer and will weaken the bow, basically helping us to get within the range that we wanted, about 20 to 30 pounds, aiming towards the high end of that at about 26 to 27 inches. That would be ideal.